I'm Richard Chambers, the Senior Advisor of Risk and Audit for Audit Board, and welcome to another in my podcast series, Speaking of Risk and Audit. I'm joined today by a colleague that some of you may have had a chance to meet before, but if not, I think you're going to find his insights very valuable and very insightful. I'm joined today by Ram Vijay Nathan. Ram is the Chief Audit Executive of Pinterest and has a pretty extensive background in the technology space. Prior to being there, he was at QVC, he was at Meta, he's also got some time at Deloitte, and you've been in your role, Ram, at Pinterest for 7 years, is that right?
Yeah, it's actually just over 6 years, Richard, and
Yeah.
actually joined them probably about 6 months prior to their IPO, which again is an interesting journey that we can further discuss. But yeah, they're about 6 plus years.
Yeah, great. Well, tell us
Yeah, yeah,
a little bit about your role. I mean, many in our audience probably will not have met you, and I want to make sure that they get to know you like we do. So, talk a little bit about what your role is there, and any other insights or perspectives on your background.
sounds good. Well, first and foremost, I want to say, Richard, and to the team at Audit Board, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And just about my role, and to answer your question, Richard, I've been with the company with Pinterest, which to give you a little bit more about what Pinterest does, we're a visual discovery platform. So we really want our 500 million plus users to have a destination where they can kind of search out and create the life they love. And in that, within Pinterest, I sit within our finance organization and obviously lead our internal audit function. Primary remit, Richard, is really around enterprise risk management as well and facilitating that process for the company, as well as executing a risk-based audit plan. So I've been doing that for about 6 years now. And it's been an interesting journey. As you mentioned, spent time in the tech sector. It's been probably 8 years in all now between Meta and Pinterest. And I will say that my background has primarily throughout my career, 20 plus years, has been in the risk and control space, and in particular serving from an internal audit capacity and as well as an external audit capacity when I spent time at Deloitte. But yeah, that's the background in a nutshell.
Well, you're in a fascinating industry. I mean, you just casually mentioned 500 million users. I mean, yeah, I had to process that in my head, even though I'd seen the number before. That's larger than the population of the United States.
There
So
you
you
go.
guys have an extraordinary customer base out there, and you're in an industry that is constantly evolving, changing, going through a lot of, even since the beginning of this year, we've seen a lot of things.
Uh,
Social media companies some of them have changed their policies, some of them have been very public about changing kind of how they're going to do certain things. So I know that it's got to be an industry that you never have a chance to take a nap because there's always something you didn't see coming. Is that fair?
you are so right. Very well put. I will say, and one of the things I love about tech, to be honest, within the tech sector and the platform sector, it is the pace of change. You walk into the role, it's never the same thing twice. Things are always moving. And I think being a steward of helping the company put guardrails in place is a challenging but rewarding task.
We're talking just about your industry, but it's really far more pervasive than just the technology industry. That
Absolutely.
the risk landscape has never been more volatile. I'm celebrating this year my fifth decade. I'll be in the internal audit profession 50 years this year. And I can tell you in 5 decades, there's never been anything remotely close to the last 5 years in terms of just how volatile, how unpredictable the whole risk landscape is. I often use the term permacrisis, just this permanent state of crisis and chaos. How do you see internal audit's role in helping companies navigate that volatility and velocity of speed, I mean, of risk?
I mean, Richard, I think as internal auditors, we have certain superpowers. And I think one of them, tried and true, has always been our ability to kind of assess risk and lead the organization through that assessment of risk. And I think, many components to that, but I think ultimately setting kind of an infrastructure where people can talk about risk and mitigation of risk. I think internal audit is well positioned to help facilitate that conversation. I think another superpower we have is our ability to kind of look at and seek out root cause. Companies always try to, and in my experience, have been, let's fix it and move on. Let's fix it and move on. And sometimes you're due to repeat it if you don't put the right fix in place. And I think we're hugely additive to that process. And recently, I guess, as I've been spending more time in my current role, Pinterest being, a fairly new company in terms of going IPO not more than 5 years ago, I think Intraud is well positioned to also bring the cross-functional organization together and talk about dependencies. What's upstream that's impacting a business problem? What's downstream if we make a change? Again, something that's true to and inherent to our profession, but really something that we can help the organization with as the increase in terms of volatility and velocity of risks hits our industry.
The technology industry is advancing so rapidly, and I've had a chance over the years. I've visited with the internal audit teams of several of the big tech companies, Facebook and others in the Silicon Valley area. And the one common thread that I've seen, and I'm curious as to whether it sort of describes your organization, is that a lot of these big tech companies really didn't want a traditional internal audit function. They said, look, metaphorically anyway, they said, look, we don't need somebody to come in here and tell us what we did wrong last year. We want somebody to come in here and help us navigate this year and next year.
Yeah.
Is that a fair assessment of how Pinterest sees the internal audit function?
Yeah, definitely. I think technology companies in particular, and just my experience there, they solve problems large and at scale. They don't want, again, I think they want to solve something so that it's one and done and fixed. And so I think the appreciation for internal auditors in the industry is more around work with us to help identify root cause and solve issues. Don't come in 6 months later, 9 months later, 12 months later to tell me that I have a problem because it goes in the face of how they operate. They are continuously innovating the product. And if we come back in 6 months after innovation and tell them, hey, you did it wrong, the value it diminishes at that point. And so that's kind of, how we work together with our stakeholders.
I once had a CEO who I was talking to him about how internal audit could improve, and he was very direct. He was kind of in my face about it, and it wasn't my CEO, it wasn't my internal audit function, so
Yeah.
maybe he was able to be a little more candid. But he said, "I don't need somebody to come in here and tell me I have problems. Know I have problems. I need somebody to come in here with solutions." And
Absolutely.
that too often, the internal auditors think they scored something just by telling me something's broken, when in all likelihood, I already knew that. It is that been your experience that too often internal auditors are content to just simply write the finding and not really focus as much on the recommendations?
Yeah, I'm very good. I'm very blessed to have a very active board and audit committee and active senior management team that's very there's a huge amount of support for us within the organization. And so I will tell you like kind of the key pillars that they operate under is again, you know, don't come in here and it's not a gotcha mentality. Tell me what the finding is and run. It's more like, hey, get me good coverage over our key enterprise and key company risks. I want to make sure that we have good balanced assurance and a good independent corroboration of that. I think they've also asked me to really give them the insights and the tools to make management and as a whole accountable, right? To ensuring that we have an optimized control environment. The one unique thing, Richard, that I've also seen more recently is, you know, these bigger, larger issues that come up quite suddenly, in addition to facilitation, just helping me kind of firefight these issues to say, all right, how can I kind of deploy resources to ensure that we're investigating these things thoroughly and thinking about mitigation in a holistic way? And so, again, we bring this kind of subject matter expertise around process, risk, and controls to the conversation. And so, I think it's really changed the dynamic of how audit operates, meaning here's an audit report and we'll come back and keep following up with the findings. Yeah, that works and there's a place for that, but there's also a place for like being more proactive and more preventative. And I think audit has a seat at the table there as well.
So, in terms of the expectations then of your audit committee and
Hmm.
management, we've sort of been describing it without actually referred to them as expectations. But are there other sort of things they're looking for out of internal audit besides those we
Yeah.
might have already touched on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is, and it's quite funny when I first started at Pinterest, like one of my first audit committee meetings, we were just getting our sea legs underneath us around SOX compliance and a few other governance measures. And my audit committee chair and the committee at large said, "Hey, I want you to help me to see around corners. Management does a great job telling me what's going on today, what's going on potentially in the next 6 to 12 months. But like, I want you to be my eyes and ears looking at the external environment, looking at and through your broad reach within the company. Talk to me about what's going on and what I need to be thinking about 3, 4, 5 years from now that I can initiate the conversation about." So I think that's a key ask as well. Not only internal, tell me what to do today, but or tell me about today, but tell me about risk of the future.
Yeah. That eyes and ears analogy is one I hear a lot,
Yeah.
especially from audit committees. Audit committees say, look, we're just board members. We're not around this company every day. We don't know what's happening when we're not here. We look to internal audit to be our eyes and ears. And so have you had that sort of feeling from an audit committee wherever you've been that they really do depend on internal audit to be able to help them to understand what's happening in the company?
They absolutely do. I think internal audit is you know, a key component of understanding. And it also helps, I think they're a key component of informing their point of view. So the audit committee is going to hear from the senior leadership team. They're going to hear from different stakeholders, risk owners, control owners. They're going to hear from the external auditors, the internal auditors, and even at times they may get some regulatory updates as well. And so they've got to they've got to bring and calibrate all that information together. And I think internal audit, again, in that facilitation type of role, can help digest that information and help them think through it. So yes, certainly.
The other term that gets used a lot, or phrase, when I talk to audit committees is about their expectations from internal audit is no surprises.
Yeah,
We want internal audit to
absolutely.
help us avoid the surprises that sometimes get audit committees and boards in trouble. A- Is that a realistic expectation in this day and age that there's somehow internal audit, and I'm not talking in your specific case, but generally speaking, I mean, as I often say, internal audit can audit anything, but it cannot audit everything. And so is it a realistic expectation to assume that there won't be any surprises? And if that's not a realistic expectation, then what can internal audit do to help influence what management and the board really thinks they're capable of?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I look, I don't think we're in a world as quick as much and in terms of the pace of change and risks evolving. I don't think we're going to be in a place where there's no surprises. I think it's things will come up. How do we best collectively and cohesively address an issue? Internal audit playing a role in that, as we've discussed, on this call. But I also think like I do spend a lot of time, Richard, communicating with stakeholders, my business partners, my senior leadership team, my audit committee members, my board around. We have a finite amount of time and a ton of risks. We are really risk assessing to basically try to address those risks that we think could have a more pervasive impact on the company. And we're going to lean in there. Now, there are other measures of control assurance that could be taken on lesser risks or other risks. But the point is, we can't be everything to everybody. And I think it's absolutely making sure we're aligned to risk appetite at all levels within the organization to make sure that at least internal audit is focusing on the right areas of risk. And maybe, Richard, I'll turn that question over to you. You published a book recently on connected risk, and I think ultimately that speaks a lot to like how do stakeholders gain an understanding of the different components and lines within the organization and how they all coalesce. What's your thoughts around kind of like no surprises and kind of managing risk at scale?
Yeah, I think those two concepts do intersect because what often happens, and it's sort of the underlying tenets behind the Connected Risk book is that organizations that your risk, your audit, your compliance professionals, your infosec, all of your different risk and oversight functions and audit and oversight functions often tend to operate in their own silo. They have a very narrow view of their mission. My mission, if I'm the chief risk officer, is I'm going to come in and tell you what the risks are, and if I'm the chief audit executive, I'm going to come in and tell you what we think the risks are, not necessarily what that other guy thinks they are, but what we think they are and what we're going to audit. Compliance folks are going to come in and say, okay, well, we're just talking about compliance risks, and here's what we think they are. The frustration that comes from that is that audit committees or boards don't quite know what to make of it all because a lot of times it's not aligned. There's different. They're using different terms, so different taxonomy,
Yeah.
and not only does it frustrate the audit committees and frustrate management, but it doesn't help the organization in terms of resiliency because
Hmm.
if there's no communication, if these different silos, if the silos are hardened, there's very little opportunity for the organization to get a holistic view of
Yeah.
what does it face. So yeah, I think to me that's one of the real challenges, one of the real strategic risks that our collective professions face in the 2020s is that, I said something recently that I thought the first half of the 2020s, one of the key lessons for me was that traditional risk management is obsolete. The
Yeah.
idea
Yeah.
that we can somehow assess risks periodically and protect the organization. That's obsolete because you think about the most significant risks that have impacted society in the last 5 years, whether we're talking about COVID or whether we're talking about supply chain disruptions or whether we're talking about war in Europe or even the most recent, catastrophes in Southern California.
Sure.
Nobody saw them coming 2 weeks before they happen in some cases, certainly not 2 months. So if I'm just gonna do a risk assessment once a year, how am I gonna help my organization endure that kind of disruption?
100% agree.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll give you a little bit of color just around like how we work with our first and second lines. I think, how you articulated it is what we're trying to bring to life, actually, Richard. Making sure that we put, in the tech sector, high velocity, like we're moving very fast, right? You know, you can't take controls and they don't supersede the kind of the progress of the company. So the collective goal is how do we put the right guardrails around the organization, but let them still move at the pace that they need to? And so that takes a lot of coordination with our first line, our second line, like functions like security and compliance, and then, you know, functions such as the internal audit area in terms of like, how do we all kind of work together to hit that goal. And Richard, I will probably say one of the things that I spend some time with is making sure that our goals are aligned. Because to your point, everybody has their silos, everybody has their performance objectives and things like that. It's just making sure that there's some commonality between them gets everybody more leaned into, all right, I think we should all be hitting this as our North Star. And then the other thing I would tell you is, and what I'm beginning to learn more and more is risk appetite is a very important, it's very different amongst different stakeholders, and finding a way to calibrate what their acceptable level of risk helps inform that conversation around how do we work together in a connected way to mitigate risks for the organization.
Yeah, and one of the things, and I talk about it in the Connected Risk book,
Hmm.
um, there's an assumption that technology is good in achieving whatever you need to achieve in an organization, and certainly technology is good if you have a good technology strategy. But what has evolved in a lot of the silos that we've talked about is that each one of them has gone and acquired their own technologies.
Yep.
So risk management has its technology, internal audit has certainly audit management systems and so forth. These technologies don't interconnect, they don't communicate, and so in some ways the technologies have hardened the silos, and it makes it
Yep.
even harder. So certainly when we think about how do we extract ourselves out of this, I think there has to be greater collaboration across the lines. And even the new I standards say this when it comes to determining what the technology solutions need to be. Everybody doesn't need to go out and pick out their own. There needs to be some collaboration and conversation. You know, we're already a few weeks into the new year, already seeing some
Mm.
unexpected things that have happened. What do you think are some of the risks that internal auditors ought to have on their radars in 2025? I won't ask you necessarily to talk about the risk you have on your radar, but what do you think if you're a chief audit executive, which you are
Yeah.
out there, what do you think are some things that ought to be top of mind to get through the
Yeah.
next
I mean, great question. This is a conversation I've been having with my peers tail end of last year into this year, just around like risk assessment, where are we going to spend our time and focus? And I would probably say just a couple that come to mind. I know everyone's talking about AI, but like, what does AI mean to your organization? So we have two use cases at Pinterest. One, our product, we use AI on the platform to power the platform. And then two, we're developing a lot of use cases internally to enable our business to further strengthen and the velocity of execution using AI. And so making sure that we have good guardrails on reliability of data and large language models, to making sure that we have, the right checks and balances to verify data that's the output. I think that's super important. Richard, I also think we're still working through, a lot of companies are, and you're hearing it through Amazon and others, in terms of the return to work policy. Where is that gonna net out at the end? And how is it gonna really impact the organization from a control environment perspective? And then you said it best, macroeconomic geopolitical risk, I think we've been hit with a ton of it. I don't think that's changing. And I think, in addition to reacting to those from a business risk perspective, it's how does the company also react to it in terms of operationally? How do we respond? I think those are
Yeah,
areas that are
I
like,
I don't want to interrupt, but
yeah,
that is an excellent point because I sometimes get pushback from folks in the broader industry or the broader profession saying, "Why are you always talking about these abstract risks? We can't change them, we can't audit them." And my point is exactly, I think, where you're going. It's not about that we're going to somehow audit environmental risks. We're not going to audit. What we're going to do is to help our organizations, our companies, assess what the potential impact is on them, and then see, does management have that on their radar, and are they have they appropriately defined and assessed that risk, and are they moving in the right direction on mitigating it? So
yeah,
I think sometimes people who have their head in the sand traditionally about this stuff just dismiss the conversation about some of these risks like macroeconomic and
sure.
geopolitical so forth because they somehow think literally we're talking about auditing that risk, and that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah. Couldn't agree with you more. I'll tell you, the other kind of like the other side of the coin is also just increased regulation. You're seeing it at the country level, you're seeing it at the state level, even municipalities. Like, how do those all come together? How does a company evaluate, interpret, and deploy a mechanism of mitigation? I think that's going to be something that Intrada to play a bigger role in, not only in what do we implement, but also understanding what we're being asked to implement. And so I think, that's kind of another area that's a focus for my team as well for the upcoming year.
And an interesting wrinkle in that though uh, is that there's now a lot of speculation that the incoming administration and
Hmm.
the shift in government is going to potentially turn the regulatory environment on its head, and that we may be about to enter a period, at least for the next 4 years, where regulation is almost a prohibited word, and that
Yep.
is a lot of stuff is going to get rolled back. A lot of compliance requirements maybe are going to be mitigated. That certainly the prospect for a lot of new regulation is probably diminished. And what I'm cautioning about is don't let that give the management in your organization comfort that they no longer have to do these things. And so, oh, we don't need as many auditors, we don't need as many compliance
Yeah.
people because we don't have those requirements anymore. Because the risk that gave rise to the compliance requirements doesn't go away. It's still
Yep,
there.
agreed. I think a lot of these things are deep within brand and reputation. And so regardless of regulatory and regulations and things like that, as a company that wants a very positive brand and a great reputation, you want to keep leaned into these things to certain degrees. And again, they may vary based on regulatory requirement, but you still want to stay leaned in. So to your point, Richard, not only do we want to kind of have that infrastructure in place, but you want to have an infrastructure that also provides some assurance around management doing the things that they're saying that they're committed to doing.
Ram, you've given us, I think, already a pretty good insight on this. But beyond assurance,
Yep.
what can internal audit do to enhance enterprise value? We're talking about these days, and the IIA standards even talk about it, about moving away from just being the value protectors to also helping organizations understand ways to create or realize value.
Yeah.
Any thoughts around that?
I think we alluded to a couple of these points, but I'll just kind of reiterate them. I think we are uniquely positioned by our broad reach in the organization to help solve cross-functional problems. So I think ultimately that's a real value add that internal audit could provide. I think we have strong process, risk, and control orientation. And in that, depending on your company and where they are with their maturity, right? That skill set, I can tell you, Pinterest is very valued. I get asked to be in a lot of conversations because, we're thinking about scale and growth, as an organization, and how do we do that in a responsible way. One thing that I've always, I think technology might solve for, and Richard, you talked about kind of like convergence of technology and not creating inhibitors by having different platforms. I'll take it maybe a different way when I think about technology as it relates to the audit function. I think analytics and AI and using that to get coverage, a broader coverage across the organization is so key because ultimately you're giving more assurance based off of auditing populations rather than samples. And honestly, like I'm kind of maybe leave it at I have a personal goal for my team to move as far up in the process as possible. So going back to kind of the beginnings of our conversation, I don't think our leadership team, I don't want to be in a position, and certainly our audit committee, where we're giving recommendations 6 months after something's happened. I'd love to be as close to the front lines as possible, understanding and helping to advise the direction, at least from a risk and controls perspective.
No, absolutely. And I think you said it as well as could be articulated. Let me ask you, as we kind of come to the close of our conversation, I recently surveyed, as I have for about the last 3 years, surveyed the professional. What do chief audit executives consider to be the most significant strategic risks that internal audit faces in these next? We're always talking about risks our organization face, but now I'm talking about turning the mirror on ourselves and say, what are the risks that should be keeping us awake at night as audit professionals? What's your thought on that?
I mean, great question. I would say what I think about, and especially kind of where I'm at with Pinterest in terms of our maturity and our growth, we're expanding to a broader set of enterprises, tackling a lot of different topics, Richard. And so it's like making sure that I have credibility with those business partners is almost like one of my top priorities. And making sure that the team that I staff, that I put in front of those business partners to do really quality driven audits is well trained and well resourced and can really talk the talk, so to speak, Richard. So I think credibility is one. And again, the number and the diversity of the risks and the topics we're talking about is only getting bigger. And so that is a very hard thing to fence around in terms of getting knowledge and building knowledge and capability. I'd say another area that I spend some time on is just making sure, and I alluded to this before, the communication channels are very, very clear in terms of where we're spending our time, making sure that everyone's aligned to, you know, the point of view of where we're spending our time and that it's tied to, the most important risks to the organization. And I think, Richard, connective risk and the concepts that you've laid out are really going to help that process because again, audit can't be everywhere and you don't want that perception of, hey, why didn't audit catch it? Well, maybe that wasn't the point of focus for audit. And then lastly, I would say, and this is just kind of the edict that I've got from the audit committee, is just staying on top of emerging risks because I think everybody in an organization, when you go through risk assessments and things like that, they're very comfortable about talking about what's in front of them, their remit, their objectives, but things like COVID and others weren't contemplated in those conversations. So how do we kind of stay on top of emerging risks that both internally and externally that could impact our organization? Last thing I think in tow, I always feel like valuable internal audit functions, the ones that serve their clients the best and serve their organizations and audit committees the best, are the ones that are very aligned to understanding the company's business planning and strategic objectives so that they can build an audit plan that best complements that.
Wow, some great insights. Ram, I really appreciate you joining me today. I know our audience is going to take a lot away from listening to you speak of risk and audit. And speaking of risk and audit is the name of our podcast.
Yeah.
And so I thank you for being one of our early guests. And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to welcoming you back to another episode soon.
Thank you for having me, Richard. It was a pleasure.